Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for being here. I'm Mary Lee Kiernan. I'm the president and CEO of the YWCA Greenwich, and we're really grateful to see you here for this important conversation. Before we get to the program, I just want to thank a few people. And first, I want to thank Jane and Alan Batkin for their generosity in sponsoring this event tonight. That sort of generosity enables us to hold important conversations for the community free of charge. So Jane and Alan, thank you so much. Yep. And I want to thank the members of our YWCA board committee who organized this event, and they are Jennifer Davidson, raise your hand, Abby Meiselman, Barbara Carr, Simi Ahuja, and Jane Batkin. So thank you all for your hard work. Let me also thank, of course, our speakers tonight, our guests, Reena Ninan, Elizabeth Conklin, Vanessa Grigoriadis, and Meredith Gold for being with us, and you'll hear more about them in just a second. I also want to acknowledge the Rowan Center in Stamford for their partnership on this event. Each of our organizations is committed to supporting victims of sexual violence, and together we are helping thousands of victims each year move forward with their lives. So February is Teen Dating Violence Awareness and Prevention Month. That is why we are all here. And as the only accredited provider of domestic abuse services in Greenwich and the local experts and educators on healthy relationships, we know this topic is particularly important in our community. Dating abuse, including sexual assault, can happen to anyone regardless of gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic standing, ethnicity, religion, or culture. Among undergraduate students, 23.1% of females and 5.4% of males experience rape or sexual assault through physical force, violence, or incapacitation. So it's really incumbent upon all of us, and we believe this strongly here at the YWCA, to raise awareness about this issue and educate young people about the differences between healthy and unhealthy relationships. That education needs to begin early, which is why YWCA Greenwich is proud to be teaching violence prevention education and healthy relationship skills at the public, elementary, middle, and high school levels, and making presentations at the independent schools every single year. Now, our purpose tonight is to have a frank conversation about today's gender dynamics and learn how adults can prepare and support young men and women who are getting ready for college. And for those students in the room, we're so happy to see you as well here tonight. Tonight is about learning the signs that indicate an unhealthy relationship, learning how to make good decisions to stay safe, and what to do if you need help. Sexual assault is not an easy topic to discuss. Some of the discussion tonight could be difficult and trigger for anyone who has experienced assault or knows a loved one who has experienced assault. We have counselors available here this evening for anyone who needs to talk. Please do whatever you need to do to take care of yourself, and that includes leaving the room. Now, let me turn this over to Reena Ninan. Reena is an anchor and correspondent for CBS News. Prior to CBS, she held positions at ABC News and at Fox News. Her journalism career has taken her from Washington to the Middle East and back. She covered the White House for ABC News, where she traveled with President Obama to Asia and with Secretary of State Hillary Clinton to the Middle East. And we're so grateful, Reena, to have you tonight. So let me turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mary Lee. And what a packed house tonight. Thank you all for coming on to talk about such an important issue. I want to get right to it and introduce our esteemed panel. Vanessa Grigoriadis, who wrote this incredible book, is a journalist and author, as I mentioned, of Blurred Lines, Rethinking Sex Power, Consent on Campus, and she'll be around to sign books, and they'll be available for purchase after. Elizabeth Conklin is Associate Vice President, Title IX Coordinator, and the Americans with Disability Coordinator for the University of Connecticut. And last but not least, Meredith Gold is the Director of Domestic Abuse Services at the YWCA right here in Greenwich. Thank you all for joining us. And I just want to let you know, I hope you all found there are more extended bios on your seats. I hope you got those. And then also, if you see the index cards with a little pencil, we're asking if you could write down a question. If something comes to mind, we're going to collect them at the end, and we'd like to be able to take your questions that way. So if you don't have one, feel free to raise your hand, and we'll get you a pencil and an index card for anybody who would like one. And as I mentioned at the end of the program, there'll be a chance to speak to our panelists if you'd like, and Vanessa's kindly agreed to sign books. So thank you very much. And without further ado, just so you know the format, we're going to let everybody speak a little bit about their area of expertise. We'll ask some questions, and then we'll open up to the floor for some questions as well. So Vanessa, without further ado.
Thank you, Reena. And thank you to Jennifer Davidson, who I know from many, many moons ago in Manhattan and brought me here tonight. So I am a journalist. I'm a long-form magazine writer. Essentially, I work for New York Magazine and the New York Times Magazine primarily. And in 2014, there was a story percolating at Columbia University, and some of you may recall this. There was a woman who was walking around with her mattress because she said that she was assaulted. The university refused to punish the boy, and she was going to carry this until the day of graduation. It was a performance art project, but it was also a political act. And it was a viral sensation, and Hillary Clinton came out and said that image of her walking around with her mattress should haunt us all. And it was a really powerful piece of art, right? Because it was this idea that this is a large burden, and it's something that is normally in the private sphere. It's a mattress, stays inside. But I'm going to take it into public sphere. I'm going to make it something where the community can reckon with it. I also need help to carry it. So the subtitle of the project was Carry That Weight, right? So people help me carry this. So it was like she needed kind of 3 students to help her carry the mattress from the library to the campus center, back to her dorm. She had a rule that she did not have to carry the mattress if she went off the campus, which I think was a smart rule. Able to take the subway, go downtown, have dinner. So what I saw in the fall of 2014, and I'm now 45, I was 40 and change, I guess, at that time, was so striking in terms of the number of students that were coming to the rallies, the way that they were talking, the articulation of the harms that they felt they had experienced, the kind of melding of this old school feminist, 1970s, really kind of rageful language with a newer, very internet savvy, let's network, kind of semi-professional idea of well, let's get somebody from Amherst involved and somebody from Yale involved, and we'll all keep our message kind of intact, and then we'll talk to HuffPo. They were being so smart about everything that they were doing that I just, and if you want me to be completely frank, I was also whoa, these are the cool girls here. This is kind of surprising to me because, I went to college in the mid-90s and I saw a whole sexual assault movement, and I saw that sexual assault movement get made fun of, on SNL. And people said, oh, those are just the girls with the, Tibetan jackets and the Doc Martens, and they're different. And it just, I said, these are not, whatever. Okay, fine. Some of these people were from the alternative dorm or whatever, but it was an issue that was bringing people from all different parts of the campus. So I said, this is going to be a big deal. I'm going to write a book about this, which was prescient, although I did not see Me Too coming. That was a step further. So the conceit of the book was basically I went, as a journalist, I have to introduce myself as a journalist. I would never pretend to be a student, but a university is a porous place. You can just walk around there. So I just wore a backpack, went to my old alma mater, Wesleyan, spent a ton of time there. It was during the year that Wesleyan actually closed down its frats because of some sexual assault issues and other things. I spent a lot of time in Syracuse University with sororities there, talking to the sorority women. And I talked to a lot of men. And I tried to write a book that, primarily parents, but people my age could read and learn about this issue and the way that kids are thinking about it today, and the way that administrators are thinking, and this kind of vast social change that is happening that we only hear about like through the media, where it's like, oh my God, this is so scary. I tried to like kind of distill it and say, look, I want to think about this logically. Yes, I'm not the person who's going to say sexual assault doesn't happen. I am down with all the stats. I am 100% there with the fact that those surveys are true, and sexual assault is happening in far greater numbers than any of us can really even wrap our heads around. But I also want to talk about this as a social issue, as an issue of sexual respect, as a moral issue, and as like a spectrum issue, and try to say to people, look, the fact is, it sounds silly to say, can I have permission for a kiss? And as adults, we know that maybe that's not the way things always happen. But we're talking about kids here. And maybe we need to teach them even that kind of level of sexual respect and say, like, look, you're an adult now. This is the new rule. This is the way adults are doing things now in college, and this is what your college wants you to do, and we think you should do it. Instead of saying, like, oh my God, there's so much scary rape going on, like, batten down the hatches, or don't be one of those guys. Because pointing fingers and batten down the hatches is not really getting through to kids. Kids want to make those decisions on their own. Maybe calling to higher morality maybe works. I'm not saying I have the statistics on that, but I think it is helpful to think about it that way in terms of really trying to change behavior. So, my takeaways that I'll just kind of briefly mention, and then we'll go to the rest of the panel, and happy to answer any questions. Just because I think there are a lot of parents in this room today, I would just say that, the things you kind of need to know about college today and kids there, is that, this is not happening on the path to the library, right? This is not happening just like all over the campus. This is an issue of a lot of kids just not having I believe, the right sexual education going into university. And also an issue of kids thinking that everybody on a campus is a friend. Like, oh, these are just like the kids I know from my school, and I know all their parents and all of that, but that's really an illusion. Like, when you go to a college bar, you might as well just be going to a local bar in town. And you wouldn't go home with just some random guy that you met at the local bar in town, right? You would think that person's a stranger. Well, a lot of these people that you're meeting on campus, even if it's a frat party, those people are strangers too. So just kind of think about it again, just in a logical way, be able to think about that and try to tell your kids that. I also come down pretty hard on the Greek system in my book. I do believe it should be co-educated. The NESCAC is almost all co-educated fraternities, if there are even fraternities in these small, private universities in the Northeast now. Harvard is not going to have them. I believe that's the wave of the future. I just don't think it makes sense. I think, of course, there are good fraternities out there. Of course there are. But the peer pressure and the social norms within the fraternity in terms of getting a girl and what a real man does when he has a girl, I don't think it makes sense. I just don't think it's a path forward, and I do think it should change, and I think it is going to change. I also, I talked a little bit about, asking permission before a kiss. There was so much talk on universities today about this yes means yes standard, or an affirmative consent standard, right, which you have in Connecticut. So it's not no means no, what it used to be, right? Everybody in this country is agreeing to have sex with everybody else until somebody says no, which, when you really think about it, it seems like a kind of crazy way to look at it. So your body is your own. You get to say yes, and it can be through some act that connotes yes. It's not like yes at every step of the encounter, full-throatedly spoken, but there should be some ongoing consent. I understand, that could be an aspirational standard, but again, that's a great standard to kind of try to get people on board with, even if it happens part of the time. Just theoretically, it just seems to make sense. And so I would also, the last thing I would say is that I'm also really interested in some of the newer ways of thinking about self-defense. Self-defense is not taught that often on college campuses. There's generally not a stranger involved that you're really going to use a lot of force against, right? Because we kind of know that women will not really use a lot of force against somebody that they know. Thereby, it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, since we know that this is like acquaintance rape, or what used to be called date rape, right? It's like friends of friends. Those are the people who are sexually assaulting. Those are the situations. You don't want to teach self-defense that's all about aggressively, putting somebody in six different kinds of chokeholds, because women are just trying to be polite and get out of the situation and go like, okay, well, maybe a little later or something like that. But teaching women to identify that a guy who seems really misogynistic and makes a lot of sexist jokes might be a guy to actually stay away from, that those two quantities actually might be kind of linked. Somebody who won't listen to you when you're talking and interrupts you all the time might not listen to you sexually as well. I think that's really important. And even just something as basic as just teaching girls, just pushing somebody away and saying, no, I don't want to do this. That can actually be effective. It doesn't have to be some special crazy move. So I think there's a lot of ways we can think about this logically and, try to get away from the emotion of it all and just try to make things better step by step. So that's my perspective.
I have so many questions for you, Vanessa, so we'll hold them till the end.
Okay.
But next, Elizabeth Conklin, who actually is the Title IX coordinator for the University of Connecticut. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you so much for having me. It's really good to be here. I grew up not far north. My mother actually grew up in Greenwich and went to Greenwich Academy, so I'm enjoying the logos. There we go. Shout out. So I am thrilled to be here in part because it's not actually that common that I have the opportunity to speak to people who are high school students or high school parents. I'm seeing students once they're at our university. And one of my main messages tonight is that I think these conversations need to start a lot sooner than when students come to college and university or the night before they arrive. These are conversations that I think start very young. And I think about this in new ways because I have a 2.5, well, he would tell you he's 2 3/4. Yeah. And fun fact, we were touring a potential school this morning, a Montessori preschool. And of course, we did the classroom observation and I noticed some kids hugging and I was kind of checking that out. And I'm the one who asks the head of school, this is what happens when the Title IX coordinator tours your school. So what are you doing around topics of, consent and touching, physical autonomy? She was like, what do you do again? But here's what she said. She said, our biggest underlying philosophy is respect. Respect for your classmates, for their concentration, for their workspace, for their body. And really, I was chuckling to myself thinking, that is one of my biggest messages today. I think that when we think about how to get underneath some of these issues, one of the things we need to be thinking about is, are students first and foremost respecting their own bodies, their own selves, their own needs, and learning to articulate those. And so the longer I'm in this work, the more I think about some of the really basic principles there. So I've been at UConn since 2010. I have a law degree, and I come to the work by way of discrimination and harassment as a civil rights issue. Before I was at UConn, I practiced labor and employment law for a few years, representing employees with claims of discrimination and harassment, so sexual harassment or disability-based harassment or discrimination. I then went to UConn, and I've really been there during this wave of activism and attention. And it's been amazing to me, just in the time I've been there, to watch how issues that even certainly when I was a student in the 90s, but then as an employee, issues that didn't see a whole lot of sunlight, that are really being spoken about. Even a topic like this here tonight and the packed room, I think it's an amazing thing. And so what I wanted to do with my few minutes now before we have questions from you, and we really want to answer the questions that you have, was to talk briefly about sort of the real basics on what is Title IX, some thoughts on how this is playing out on campus, some practical tips. I've also got a video to show to you, so get excited for that. All right, so when we think about Title IX, we're thinking about the words on a screen, and I'm sorry, I only have like 5 slides, so I'm not gonna kill you by PowerPoint. But I think it's helpful to actually read the words. This is Title IX. So when we think about a lot of the details about things like investigations or prevention, that's all in regulations. Some of it's in state law, some of it's in other federal laws. We're going to talk, I think, later during the Q&A about the current status with the new administration of some of the rollbacks, some of the rescissions, some of the proposed rules. But Title IX at its heart is about parity between all genders on campus. It's really important to note that this isn't about just women or just men. All gender identities are protected. This is really at its heart a civil rights statute and was used the most prominently for a long time in ensuring women's parity in athletics. So I think until this most recent wave, and even for years, until I would say the last 3 years, when I would talk about being the Title IX coordinator, people assumed I was in UConn athletics. And when I wore heels, maybe basketball, which was exciting for me. But no, it does apply to sports, and I think it's been used really effectively there and visibly there. But it's really about ensuring that folks on any campus, and I would note, this applies K through 12. So any educational campus that receives federal funding needs to follow this law. So for those of you in a public K through 12 setting, Title IX applies, the rights and the responsibilities. And I think that that's an important thing for us all to keep in mind. And so I think one other thing to note is that while we often talk about the sort of very hetero cisgender norms of male perpetrators and female victims or survivors, and the statistics show us that that's the most common fact pattern, sexual assault can and does happen always. You can have female perpetrators, you can have male victims, and certainly we know from the research that folks who don't present in the classic way face even greater barriers in coming forward. So LGBTQ students are at much greater risk, and there are barriers in coming forward. And we see that on college campus sometimes with students who say, I'm not out, and I'm worried that if I come forward with a complaint from a same gendered person, that my parents will find out. So I think that we need to think about really being cognizant that there are additional barriers. We have students of color who say, I don't want to make a report because if the police get involved, I don't trust that process. That's never been a good process for me, for my community. So we really work very hard on our campus to be mindful of the intersectionality of identities and what that means for people's lived experiences of these issues, including barriers to accessing an office like mine. What I do on campus is oversee ensuring students and employees' civil rights. We look to see that we're doing everything we can to prevent these incidents, but also to respond appropriately, to provide resources, but also to provide fair investigations. I am sure, like me, there are other parents of sons in the room who are also saying, what does that mean for me? And what does that mean? How do I sort of give my son the best advice that I can? And also, what does it mean if they find themselves on the receiving end of a Title IX complaint? So I think I'll get to that in the very tail end of what I talk about. So when we think about sexual misconduct on a campus, one of the most common things, so the Hartford Courant is kind of big up where we are. And so whenever there's an article on this topic, if you do the thing where you read comments, I don't know how many of you do that. Like, I don't think it's good for your health, but I can't stop myself. Who are these people? I don't know. But when you scroll and you read the comments, even now on this issue, one of the most frequent ones is, why are colleges investigating these things? This is a police matter. So the real quick version on how that works is that when there is sexual misconduct on a campus, it is in fact a crime, but it's also a violation of the university policy. And under the civil law that the Department of Education enforces, colleges have an obligation to respond, up to and including investigations. So it's not just colleges meddling because they think they should or they're trying to avoid police involvement. I certainly can't speak for every campus, but I can speak for mine. One of my greatest relationships is with our police department. A student ultimately who experienced the incident has the power to determine whether they want to proceed criminally or through the school, both or neither. And the vast majority choose resources and support, with a smaller number choosing a university investigation. A much, much smaller amount choose a police investigation. That's a much longer conversation, but some of that is that some of the acts that would violate a university policy would not necessarily be crimes. The concept of affirmative consent is not in place as a criminal matter. It's a policy determination. So just one of the ways to sometimes think about that dual jurisdiction is that, if a student were dealing drugs on a campus, I think it's easier to understand, well, that'd be a crime. If a student were stealing laptops, that'd be a crime. So you've got lots of things outside of the sexual assault realm that can be both a criminal act and a violation of university policy. So that's some of the framing around the very understandable common question about, well, why are colleges in this at all? We're in this because sexual assault is the most severe form of sexual harassment. And that's a form of sex discrimination. If you're experiencing that, you're probably being deprived your access to your educational opportunities. So that's how that all breaks down. It's a little bit of an umbrella. That's my video. So I would just say before I get to that, so our priorities on any campus, but certainly I can speak to our process, are to first and foremost support the student who comes forward and says, this happened to me. And one of my tips for you is, as you're looking at colleges, pay some attention to what are the resources and what is the education. Google, for example, UConn Title IX. I think your first hit, we've worked hard to make sure it's your first hit, so I hope it is, will be our Title IX website that has exhaustive resources, 24/7, tips, links to prevention education. I think some of that, those online resources are a bit of a tell for you. Another one are our annual security reports that we all file called Clery reports. Now you might think low numbers of reported assaults is a good thing. In my experience, low numbers of reported assaults can mean that students don't trust going forward to tell administrators. So as counterintuitive as it might seem, looking at schools that are reporting these things tells me that the students are coming forward to tell the administration about them. Here in Connecticut, all schools under state law must file an annual report to the legislature that captures all of the incidents that are reported to the school for sexual assault, intimate partner violence, and stalking. We must provide copies of policies and all of our prevention activities. Those are really illuminating. I think I read them, the other Title IX coordinators, and like 3 staff members within the legislature. So if you would read them, that would quintuple the audience. All right, so we do a lot around prevention education, and I thought it would be helpful for folks to get on the same page about what is consent, what is affirmative consent, and how do we talk to students about it. So this is a little bit of a cheeky video. It's about 1.5 minutes long that uses a sandwich. Some people have seen tea. This is a little different. This is a sandwich to explain consent. I did not create this video, so just so you know, but it's got some catchy kind of theme music, so here we go. Oh, I have to hit forward? You got it.
see how that can.
Okay, so that's like a little cheeky, but sometimes it can help to take discussions out of the sexual assault realm and speak about the topics in a way that can feel a little more comfortable. We use some exercises at UConn based on a student asking another student to go out. The dairy bar is a big deal at UConn, for those of you who know it. We have our own cows, they make great ice cream. And they're treated really well. Like, I'm super into animal rights, and they're doing some really neat things. They can decide when they get milked on their own. So I like that. Yes, yes. Consent to milking. So we use an exercise where we have a president of a student organization asking a student to go to ice cream at the dairy bar. Yale uses a very similar exercise. And it can be helpful to kind of grasp the concept that there can be power dynamics at play. In our situation, it's a president, it's a high status person, but also the idea that consent is sort of easy to figure out. So I think one of the things that happens in this conversation is this idea that it's really blurry, it's hard to figure out, but we actually know students are very attuned to figuring out subtle cues. And I think one of the important things is making sure that folks are listening and sending those cues as clearly as they can. So when I think about, I'm going to end with some sort of practical tips. I've talked about respect, and we could talk for hours about that, but I think really, so my office receives all reports of sexual assault on campus. So I have been on the receiving end of all the reports that the administration has received for a lot of years. And you start to see certain trends and themes when you're overseeing the reports and also investigating the cases. And I think the clearer that we can be on all sides about communicating our needs, our desires, and our wishes. And what we talk about is, if you really break down affirmative consent, what that is, that's what a healthy sexual exchange looks like. And if we're even parsing out the consent definition and investigation, we're probably talking about a sexual experience that, whether or not it violated a law or policy, wasn't a great sexual experience. So I think there are some linkages to empowering sexual education in some of this work. What I would encourage you to do is really understand affirmative consent. Maybe see on which works for you, maybe you think that's silly, but figure out a way to talk about it and to really understand what does that look like, to give it, to receive it. I think that we're gonna have more conversation about this, but these aren't issues that are starting at the college door. So we know from research from the CDC that our students, in particularly grades 7 through 12, are very vulnerable, particularly girls age 14 to 17, and this is real. And so I think drinking is happening, we know sex is happening, we know sexual assault is happening. And so we know that if we are seeing those trends begin before college, there are certain repeat victimization or repeat perpetration that can be playing out then. So I think being honest as a community that if you have a student who's in that age range, you're already in this mix, and this is already a conversation that needs to be happening. And then, as I said, spend some time as your college touring. Maybe that's not the question you ask like I did at pre-K, but today. But spend some time really looking at, what does the commitment appear to be, and how do administrators answer this question? Is there information readily available? So I'd be happy to talk more during Q&A about high-status students, athletes, fraternities. I have a lot of thoughts on that. We've done a lot of work in those communities, and I think those high-status students can actually be some of the most powerful agents for change on campus. So I have a slightly more positive view while understanding that there are risks, certainly, that need to be managed. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for letting us know about your website, that there are so many resources there as well. I'm curious about the cows and the ice cream, too.
Yeah.
Take a campus visit.
Great.
Want to know more about that.
Pesky tracks, flavor to get.
And finally tonight, Meredith Gold, who is the Director of Domestic Abuse Services here at the YWCA.
Thank you. Thanks so much to each of you for joining us tonight, to come out during the week for such a heavy topic. We really appreciate it. And thank you so much to our guests for joining us in our community here. So sexual violence has been around since the dawn of time, right? Remember the caveman who clubs his girlfriend over the head and drags her into the cave. This is not something that's new, although we seem to be hearing about it more and more as victims and survivors are coming forward in numbers that we haven't seen. Victims and survivors are sharing their stories to hold abusers accountable, seek justice, and to support each other. But it's important to remember that these intimate crimes are still some of the most underreported. So the staggering statistics that we're aware of just are the tip of the iceberg of what we know is really happening. And one population that we've already discussed that's arguably the most at risk is young people. So this obviously is happening at college campuses, but as Elizabeth mentioned, it's happening at the high school level, it's happening at middle school level, even elementary students are dealing with this kind of victimization by their peers and also by adults. And the short and long-term impact of this kind of trauma is severe, and it's pervasive and could be lifelong and could emerge in lots of different ways across the lifespan. And here at the YWCA Greenwich, we provide a full spectrum of services for victims and survivors, for their friends, family members, and coworkers to offer support for those who are in need, and we will always continue to do that. But if we really want to make an issue on this impact, which we see as a public health issue, we need to start at the beginning, the very beginning. I'm going to share a quick story with you that some of you in the room I know have heard me tell before. So imagine you are having a picnic by the river on a beautiful day, not in the middle of winter like it is now. And as you are sitting down to enjoy your afternoon next to the river, you notice that there's someone floating down the river, and they're struggling, and maybe they're grasping for air, and they're starting to drown. And so, of course, what do? You put down your sandwich, you rush over, you fish them out of the river, you sit them down, you put a blanket around their shoulders, you offer them the support that they need. And then a few minutes later, you notice that someone else comes down the river, and they're also in trouble, and they also need help. And so you do the same. You get them out of the water, you sit them down, you make sure they're safe, and you continue. And as the day goes by, more and more people are floating down the river until finally, at one point, you say, you know what? I'm going to take a walk up the hill and find out why are all these people falling in the river? Because we can continue to take people out who are in trouble, and we will always do that. But if we really want to make a dent in this issue, we have to talk about prevention, stopping people from falling in the river in the first place. So the mission of the YWCA, as you all know, is eliminating racism and empowering women. And we work through the community at every age level to increase protective factors for girls and women. We teach girls to express themselves, to increase confidence and self-esteem, to be able to acknowledge what they're good at and to be proud of that. We encourage them to support each other. We support women and girls to be physically strong and to be aware of their power. We support girls and women to use their voices for policy change and for social justice. But let me be really clear about this. There is absolutely no way to educate, empower, or support anyone from becoming a victim. Abuse and violence is never a victim's fault. 1 in 5 women and 1 in 7 men will be raped at some point during their lifetime. Women and men, girls and boys. And overwhelmingly, the perpetrators of this kind of violence are men. 80% of boys who are sexually assaulted are assaulted by a man, and 95% of girls, their perpetrators are men. And so again, I want to be very clear, we're not here to wag my finger at men and boys and say that all men and boys are bad. In fact, most men and boys are not violent, are not abusive, are very caring and supportive and loving. And they actually condemn the violence. But we need to look at the facts. And again, we need to talk about prevention if we really want to change this. And often when we talk about these kinds of issues, sexual assault, domestic violence, harassment, very often they're easily dismissed as sort of women's issues. And in fact, to quote one of our great heroes, a man named Jackson Katz, who's done tremendous work on violence prevention, by definition, this is a men's issue. So what is going on in our culture that this kind of behavior has become so normalized when we talk about the perpetrators? It's boys being boys. He couldn't help himself. That's what's to be expected. And the burden is so easily placed upon the victim. She was wearing that. She went to the party. Didn't she know what was going to happen? She was probably drunk, right? And so if we think back to the picnic at the river for a moment, the best way to stop people from falling in the river is to reach both women and men, trying to shift our culture, our values, and our beliefs to change our behavior. So the YWCA Greenwich delivers prevention and education throughout the community, as many of you know, for students as young as first grade, all the way up through high school. And I'll tell you more about these specific programs in a moment, but I want to acknowledge that through my own work with young people, I've realized that sometimes the perpetrators of assault don't even realize that what they're doing is wrong. So I'll tell you a quick story. It's a little explicit. My colleague and I were running a group with high school boys where we got to know them pretty well. And one of the boys was telling us about a recent experience he had had with his girlfriend. He had had intercourse with her several times in the past, and there was one day they had been recently fooling around, and for whatever reason on that day, the girlfriend didn't feel like moving forward for full intercourse that day. She didn't want to go all the way. And he was sharing this story with us because we were talking about how confusing sex can be, how relationships can be really confusing and almost like a head trip. And so he said, in that moment, and he said this with no hesitation, no embarrassment, no reservation. He said, so we were fooling around, and I just slipped it in. And we looked at each other in disbelief. Here was a young man with no reservation admitting to two adults in the room, as well as his peers, that he had sexually assaulted his girlfriend. And I share this story because it really struck us, and to think about how many particularly young people are engaging in these behaviors without any context, without having had the relationship around consent. He had no intention of raping his girlfriend or assaulting his girlfriend, and in fact, when we had the conversation with him, he was very upset to learn that he had actually done something that was a crime. So it's extremely important to have these conversations early, as Elizabeth and Vanessa have already mentioned, very early. And when we talk about consent, consent doesn't have to be sexualized. Consent is about asking for permission and giving permission. It's about communicating. And so when we work with our first graders, second graders, third graders, we're not necessarily, obviously, not necessarily, we are definitely not talking about sexual consent. But we're talking about things like if you're building a tower of Legos and someone else wants to come over and knock it down, having a conversation about that, giving permission and getting permission. Body autonomy, which has come up already. Teaching children, and as parents, we need to encourage parents not to force your child to hug their uncle. It's okay if a child on the way home doesn't want to kiss and hug every adult in the room or any of the adults in the room. And what a powerful message to that young person to say, that's okay, you don't have to, that is your body. And so that's not sexualized. These conversations need to happen very early. And this is exactly what we're trying to do here in Greenwich. And we're so fortunate to have the support of our community to do so. I already talked a little bit about what we're doing at the elementary level. At the middle school level, our community education team is in every public middle school, engaging with every 6th and 8th grader on multiple occasions around healthy relationships, allowing for opportunity for meaningful dialogue about what a relationship is these days when so many students have friends who are online or that they've met through playing video games that maybe they've never even met, but they feel that these are friendships. Is that really a relationship? And then, of course, breaking down what's healthy and unhealthy about the relationships. We also deliver the Girls Circle curriculum at all of the public middle schools, which is specifically to build those protective factors I mentioned before for girls. At the high school level, we deliver classroom presentations and sponsor the YNET Club. Many of those students are here today. Hey, guys. Who are trained and educated to support their peers, raise awareness around teen dating violence, and connect them to services and help if necessary. We've also successfully partnered with several of the independent schools in town, and thank you so much for being here to continue our partnership. We're always amazed at how open and earnest young people are. If we set the tone of being comfortable to speak with them, they're comfortable to speak with us. They are really looking to us to model, is this okay to talk about? Is that an appropriate question to ask? And we need to make it comfortable. Even if we're uncomfortable, we have to fake it till we make it to really support our young people. Recently, some of our efforts have centered around engaging student athletes and coaches. You may have heard about the efforts we're doing here in Greenwich, and we're really excited about this initiative, and I'd love to hear more about what Elizabeth's doing with UConn to leverage the high status, or what we call social capital, of students as leaders to set the example of what is socially acceptable behavior. We see this as a leadership issue, and similar to the success of other prevention initiatives like drunk driving, the initiative to get young people to wear seatbelts. If there becomes a shift in what is cool and what's socially acceptable, then we're encouraging potential perpetrators not to be abusive and violent because they're afraid they're going to get caught or because they're going to get in trouble, but because it's just the right thing to do, and that's what becomes the cool thing to do. So thank you for being here. Looking forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much. And I just want to remind everyone about the index cards. If you have a question, if you wouldn't mind on this side maybe passing it to the left, the far left, so we could collect them, and maybe on this side passing them to the far right, so we could collect them. And that way, if you pass it off, it'll be easy to collect throughout the evening. We definitely want to take your questions. I want to start off, Meredith, and ask you a question because I think often when we cover this topic in the media and in the news, you don't think about assault from the accused perspective. So I want to start there for 1 second and just ask you, if you are the parent of a son who is off on campus, gets accused, what do you do?
It's a really great question. I think the very first thing to do, as Vanessa suggests in her book, is to have your son or child call you first to talk about a strategy and to really make that response individualized to each incident. Again, my area of expertise is what happens before that moment happens, so I would encourage all of the parents to speak to your children before they're in that situation and to let them know. I love the video, the sandwich video. We love the tea video as well. Consent is pretty simple to figure out when you really break it down that way.
And I would just add that, there is obviously a lot of fear around boys being accused, erroneously, let's call it. Even I wouldn't call it false. But, these cases, there are some of them. We can't say that that doesn't happen at all. The way I like to think about this is it doesn't mean the totality of victims are lying and the totality of men are innocent. Some people lie about things. That's part of our society. There will be exceptions to the rule and there will be a few false accusations, but it is truly the exception to the rule that you would get somebody who would want to go to the lengths of falsely accusing somebody. But in general, we also need to understand that the number of cases that are brought in a college is really low. I crunched some of the numbers back in 2016, and it was something like 1 in 1,000 boys on a college campus. So that's like the same risk of a man getting breast cancer. So I I believe, yes, you should, if it's something you're concerned about, you should tell your boys, if this was to happen to you, your first call must be to me. That's just, I'm sorry, that's just smart. That's just protecting your child. But, also, you don't need to live in fear of it. This is the most likely scenario is you're never going to have to deal with something like that.
Elizabeth, you were talking jokingly about the preschool tour that you went on. And I was just curious, when is the right age to start having that conversation with your kids?
Yeah, I think it is that young. And I agree so wholeheartedly with the idea of allowing children to have bodily autonomy. My work is really more centered on the legal civil rights framework, but being in this field, I've read a lot of the research and studies, and now being a parent of a young one, there is a perspective shift, and I think some of what I've learned from our partners on campus who do some work around protection of minors. So on any given campus, I think as Penn State told us, there are minors on campus, or Dr. Nassar, Michigan State. So campuses are also thinking about the minors on their campuses as we are. And we've worked closely with the experts there, and they talk about the importance of things like using the actual names of body parts. Because euphemisms can be a tell to a parent. If all of a sudden you have a child using a nickname you've never used in the house for a private part, that can be a tell that somebody else is accessing them. And so these are things that are really, I think, learned. And the longer I'm in this work, the more I feel like the education begins with parents, ideally before we even have kids. There's no manual for any of it, including this piece of it. But I think the more that community programs like the Y and others can offer programming at the youngest ages. We do have state law in Connecticut since 2016 requiring consent education K through 12. At the K through 6 level, it's not sexualized, but it does reinforce some of these concepts of affirmative consent. So, for better or for worse, my son Henry gets to be the guinea pig for some of this, for me. But I think that's been an important lesson. So I think that it literally starts from the beginning, but it's never too late to start. So, I think it's always really, we have students who come up to us after orientation and say, this is the first time that I have been in an honest conversation about sex, where it wasn't an abstinence-only message. Where we were talking about the fact that people might drink and what that means. And I think that that's a really important thing. And I think that the students who feel that they can have that candid conversation with their parents are better served and tend to come in more prepared for those moments at midnight at a party when none of us are there. So I think
uncomfortable though. It's uncomfortable no matter what age it is to start talking to your kids. But you're saying it's important to start very early on so they don't feel this anxiety over talking with them.
I think there are ways to talk about it. It's hard to script it for any individual parent because you have your own style and your own way of talking about it. That's right. But I think figuring out how to open that door and going ahead and walking through it, even if it's clunky, is much better than the silence probably a lot of us grew up with.
Yeah, the silence, it's so true. Vanessa, one of the things doing the research for this that I was actually surprised to learn about the state of Connecticut, there's only 5 years when it comes to going back and looking at sexual assault cases. Can you talk to us a little bit about that? And also, I remember us extensively covering in 2011, President Obama sent this Dear Colleague letter to schools, 4,600 schools around, and everybody hailed this as a big, big turning point. And I just remember being so confused when we were reporting this, saying, explain to me what's changing here. Like, it's like a please, folks, can you follow this policy? But how are you going to regulate this? What are you going to do? Can you talk to us a little bit about that moment as well?
Okay, I'm going to throw part of this to the expert on
right.
that
Sorry,
here.
You're right, yeah.
But look, everything changed in 2011. So when I got there in 2014 to Columbia, part of what I was seeing was that in 2011, Obama issued a Dear Colleague letter to all the universities that get federal funding and basically said, please take the sexual assault situation very seriously. We would like you actually to put victims first. We'd like a different standard of proof, or we'd like you all to use a slightly lower standard of proof, this standard that is, it's more likely than not that this act occurred. We want you to have a lot of protective services. We want you to have these hearings actually happen instead of what was happening before, which was essentially like, okay, that female student or male student who is the victim seems to be having a really hard time. Maybe it would be better if you just went home for the semester and you don't really need to come back, do you? Like, people were just basically kind of leaving, transferring. Obviously, this is still happening, but so it was really a call to action. A lot of what I chronicle in my book is the way that student activists across the country, like your people working on the newspaper, your political science majors, your people who are interested in women's issues or sociology, started to really look at this law. And administrators were, of course, really interested in what was happening too. And particularly at Yale and Amherst and then the University of North Carolina, students, some of whom were also survivors, started to network from college to college. Now, that never happened in the 90s. Like, there was a whole thing that happened at Brown University, right? And all the women were writing in the women's bathroom down the names of the guys to stay away from. Brown University, in I think it was 1991, said to the New York Times, those women are magic marker terrorists. And if we figure out who they are, they're off the campus, okay? But it wasn't like Brown and Yale and Wesleyan students could all get together and try to, make action happen on Facebook at that time. Everybody was just, there wasn't even email, right? So these women, kind of post-2011, ramping up to 2004, 2015, started to really network. And they also realized, well, it's not so hard to get in touch with journalists. It says, like, right here, Twitter, Journalists seem to be interested in my story. That seems like a story, it bleeds, it leads, I can get in touch with them. And really, we're so incredibly adept at creating both, a media campaign, but also being, they ended up being also subjects for legislators to talk to their state legislatures and say, let's push these laws a little bit further. So, it was a kind of amazing thing that happened. I mean, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about what's happening now. I mean, who is aware of what's going on with the Department of Education and how these laws are, or whatever, these encouraging
Betsy DeVos has put in, the education secretary has put in some new guidance. Maybe you can give us sort of a heads up as to where that's going.
Yeah, so 2011 happened, and it was not just the Dear Colleague letter, but also, as I mentioned briefly, Penn State. And I think it was sort of a 1-2 moment for colleges. I will say a lot of what was in the 2011 letter had been written in a 2001 letter and a 1997 guidance letter. So I would argue that while it certainly was a major tone change, the actual substance was some of what was already considered best practice, including using the preponderance of the evidence standard. But nonetheless, certainly nobody can argue that the amount of attention, staffing, funding for prevention and response was greatly enhanced over the 8 years of the Obama administration. And then we had the 2016 election, and things are a bit different in some ways, although I think there is a little bit of a pause happening at the moment. So the really brief version is that virtually all of what happened under Title IX during the Obama administration was through these Dear Colleague letters, which are guidance. They don't have the weight of law. And there were some concerns about that from a procedural standpoint that a lot of folks had. So the new administration said, we're rescinding all of that guidance, and rescinded it, and said, what we're going to do is go through a formal notice and comment period for rulemaking. And this will become regulation, which does have the force of law. So in late November, they put out different people's printers print this differently. My version was 145 pages. Some of my colleagues had 149 pages. But this proposed rulemaking guidance, there was a 60-day period for comment, and there were over 100,000 comments made to the Department of Education, which is like a lot. From higher ed, from survivors, from respondent rights groups. And so I think that where we sit right now within higher ed is we've invested a lot of time and energy and frameworks and finances into our prevention and response to sexual assault. I think for the most part, higher ed is staying the course because we don't know what the final regulations will look like. I can't tell you what the timeline is either, but they are not going to alter our fundamental commitment to doing this work right. The big changes that they would render are around some of the procedures about investigations. The really brief version is that they cause a school's administrative investigation process to look very court-like, with the right to advisors who are allowed to cross-examine students. I think that this would be a very major change that I think most in higher ed are quite concerned about, the sort of conflation between the administrative and the criminal processes.
And I would also just say that Betsy DeVos, so part of my book was also talking to parents of boys who were accused of sexual assault. And, where Obama worked with the survivors, Betsy DeVos very clearly had multiple meetings with groups who were essentially the moms of the accused boys, who also networked through the internet and figured out who was who and created their own kind of lobbying coalition, and have been very instrumental in putting their stories out. That's really why you heard a lot of their stories in the last year or two. Oh my God, there's another boy who's been accused. There was a pretty concerted effort to do that.
And I would just, last comment on that, say that when she did the press release to announce the proposed regulations were coming, she referred to survivors of sexual assault and victims of a lack of due process to explain
Right.
men who
That was
had
due
been.
process
Yeah.
is
So
the
that was
boys
a-
who
that
are
was a sea
the
change.
boys who are going through a
Right.
court a hearing at school who may or may not have gotten enough due process from the way Obama was running it.
Meredith, I want to ask you, and I just want to remind everyone about the questions. If you don't mind this side, just passing them over to the left and to the right. We'll get to those in just a moment. Meredith, I found a very powerful moment during the USA Gymnastics and the Dr. Larry Nassar was seeing those victims come forward and confront Larry Nassar. I just found it so powerful. How do you empower, and I hate even using the word victim because I really feel like survivor is a much better term, but how do you empower girls, whoever may be a victim? How do you deal with that, and how do you empower their voices so they don't feel diminished?
It's a really great question. The very first thing is to listen and to believe what they say, number one. Every survivor's experience is different, and so we don't see our job to tell survivors or victims what they should do. We help them understand what they could do. For many survivors, sharing their story publicly, facing their abuser is an empowering moment, is a way for them to feel that they're seeking justice and holding their abuser accountable. For others, it's not something that they ever want to do, and that's okay too. So that empowerment really comes from helping survivors understand what their options are, encouraging them to make the choices that they feel are best for themselves, being an advocate, and to support them. I'm thinking about the question you asked about the 5-year statute of limitations, and I'll share another story of a young woman who I knew when she was in high school. I knew her very well through the YNET program, and she recently contacted me after graduating with her master's degree in psychology and said that she was calling because she just told her parents that she had been sexually assaulted when she was in high school. And here she was, 23 years old, exactly 5 years later, and finally ready to start sharing her story. And so the statute of limitations expires 5 years after a minor becomes an adult, or for adults it's 5 years from the onset. And so her not having the opportunity to move forward with a criminal charge doesn't mean that she doesn't have other ways to reclaim her power and to find ways to find that support and strength. And the most important thing, as I said before, is to listen to victims, believe victims, don't minimize their experiences, and offer support in the way that they need best. And we don't, even us who have been doing this work for quite some time, we're not the experts, they are. So it's okay to ask as a parent or a friend, what do you need right now?
Just a simple question as that. Vanessa, I look at some of my European friends and their approach to alcohol, and it's so different in European countries. The drinking age is much lower. You talk about this in your book a little bit, that you believe sexual assault on campus, something that could be done is lowering the drinking age. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little counterintuitive, but it seems to me that, a lot of what we're talking about is happening on residential campuses, right? When we're talking about student on student, because they're hanging out all the time. And it doesn't make sense that part of the campus can drink legally and the other part can't. If you could lower the drinking age to 18 and figure out a way to make it more like Europe, where people have wine with dinner, or just integrated into people's lives, it wouldn't be so exciting to get the keg from the older guy, or who gets to go up to the third floor to have the special whiskey with the special guys up there, which girls get to go there. Like, all of those things would kind of disappear a little bit. And also, one of the issues that I do fault universities for a little bit is that they have pushed the drinking completely off of their campuses. They don't want it in the dorms, they don't want it, no wine if you go to some event, campus event. Like, it is, you're not going to like the French department to have a glass of wine on Friday night with your professor. People are going to get wasted at the frats, and that kind of works for the university from a liability perspective, and also brings their costs down because they don't need to worry about everybody's social lives. But they're like a place like Dartmouth, which has had a really pretty bad history with hazing, has done some major changes. Like, I'm not even sure you can buy hard alcohol in Hanover anymore. Not allowed to have hard alcohol in any of the frats. Like, a student told me they were bringing it in like shampoo bottles. And they're a very rich school, right? So they're able to, what they did is they went into the university and tried to redesign some of the dorms and make them more appealing, and make them more have fun, cute, cozy rooms, and traditional student unions, and sweatshirts with the name of your dorm, and there's extra money. Like, do you want to bring in a chef to make Thai food tonight? And what students want to, arrange that? I mean, a friend of mine's little sister was there and said, they got this top flight DJ, and there were 3 kids who showed up. So they still want to go to all the frats. That's still happening. But, it's a little bit of a third rail to talk about sexual assault and alcohol, because, certainly we don't blame anybody who is drunk, but it does seem like when you hear the stories, I mean, this is coming up over and over and over. And alcohol really, it doesn't make anybody sexual assault, but it allows some people who, it just gives them the ability to say, well, I was drunk, so I don't know what I was doing. I mean, you probably don't even remember either. It really is cloudy.
I want to take there's some great questions here. I want to start maybe Elizabeth, if you want to take this question. It says, can a school be expected to investigate an assault allegation if the victim waits many months to report the incident? What is a reasonable role for the school? What about local police? And what is their responsibility?
Yeah, that's an important question. So a school's investigatory capabilities are going to be based on whether the person who's accused, or in our lingo, the respondent, whether the respondent is still part of the community. So if the student is still a student, I think best practice has told us that most schools don't have statutes of limitation for the school process. That's something to look at. Certainly we do not. So if the student is still a student, even if it's months or years later, we can proceed if the complaining student wants to do so. And we know it's not uncommon for there to be that reporting gap. So 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, not uncommon. We have come to understand and expect that. The less common report is the immediate report. Similar for employees. So I was mentioning before we started, the week of the Brett Kavanaugh hearings was the busiest week I've experienced at UConn, with people coming forward to say, I want to tell my story. We saw something similar during the Larry Nassar sentencing. And shout out a podcast called Believed by Slate, all about how did he get away with it for so long. It's a must listen for parents and for school administrators, because it looks at what did Michigan State do? Because they did several investigations that exonerated him before it was really a go-getter, somewhat young police detective within their department that took this and ran with it. Wow. So it's a really interesting listening. For employee cases, it would depend on whether the employee was still employed. So I would say that in my experience and in my opinion, we should not be having statutes of limitation, although understand that a school can only act if the person is still a member of the community. A school doesn't have powers over somebody who's not a member of the community any longer. So for the police, it depends on the statutes of limitation within the jurisdiction where the incident occurred.
Do you ever think we'll get to a point where there won't be statutes of limitations? Do you think that's a...
I think it's possible. I am aware, I just read a piece of draft legislation in Connecticut extending it to 10 years. I think it's a question of who's in office and what kind of lobbying efforts are ongoing.
Meredith, this question I want to toss to you because it talks a little bit about developmentally normal activity, which we sometimes kind of forget. Do you need consent to take a girl's hand, put your arm around her? Has it gone too far? Pornography, for instance, or assault, you know it when you see it.
Really great question. Generally, working with young people and adolescents, it's hard to tease out what is normal developmentally and what could be a problem. As young people are seeking to form their own identities and find their people, we like to say, find their tribe, you could see behaviors that could be warning signs to you of something, but could just be normal adolescent behavior. So has the idea of consent gone too far? We've heard some conversations with some of the groups that we've run that I talked about before. That makes it not sexy to have to ask every 5 minutes, is it okay if I do this? Is it okay if I do that? I think I would argue that, again, if this becomes a shift of a cultural norm of this is just, as Vanessa mentioned before, this is just what we do now. This is how adults engage in this kind of behavior. And whether that's, again, as I said before, about sexual activity, but just general activity, I don't think that it is unreasonable to encourage young people to make sure that the people they're interacting with are okay with the interactions. To me, that's just fundamental pro-social healthy relationships. And I think that as we evolve and get more comfortable about this, I'm hopeful that we'll find some language and some ways to be able to talk to young people about this, that it still feels like it's fun, right? We don't want to take the fun out of it. We're not saying don't have sex, don't explore your sexuality. Well, some people might be saying that, but we're saying, we're encouraging people to just have conversation about it.
Yeah.
And I would, if I can, this is more your realm than mine, but affirmative consent is not all may I, yes. It can be acts. So we often give the example of removing one's own clothing would be expressing affirmative consent. Taking off one's own pants would be expressing affirmative consent. So I just don't want folks to walk out thinking like the rule at college is that you have to, I've had some students say like, should I get a signed contract? I hope that we don't go there. I mean, there are students who ask me, particularly high status students who ask me, should I tape record the yes? I think that gets us into questions that concern me from a healthy exchange viewpoint. And if we're having a healthy sexual exchange, those types of questions aren't entering our mind. And I feel like I would be remiss in not saying that, as a parent, so what does this look like? Every case is different. But there is a common fact pattern that I'll lay out, which is laid out in your book as well. It's what your book refers to as an in-network stranger, friend of friend, someone that they don't know well, but they feel safe with because they've seen them in class or it's a friend of a friend. That in the sort of real world would be kind of a stranger, but there's a presumed safety. It's the first night that they've ever been together. It may be the only night, and there is drinking involved. And that is a very common fact pattern. And when I conduct trainings for our students, which I do some of myself, I talk about that's a moment to really pay attention. So it's the first time you're together, there's drinking involved, you don't know each other well. It can be difficult to know if somebody's incapacitated if you don't know them well. Some people, when they're really, really drunk, become really, really quiet. And so their friends after the event say, we knew that she was incapacitated because she wasn't herself, but you don't know that if you don't know her. And the reverse is true too. So we often talk about that's a moment, and I live on, I don't actually live on campus, but I live in the real world and I work on a campus, and I know that's a really common fact pattern for lots of healthy hookups, or maybe, but not sexual assault. But that's a moment to pay attention. The first time encounters with someone you don't know well. And that's a place when I have parents with children who are headed to college and they say to me, I know what you do for your work. Like, what do I tell my kid? Like, get really specific with me about where is the danger zone.
Yeah.
That's the most common fact pattern I see.
I think also, something that comes up over and over is like somebody's friend from the lacrosse team from home is coming to visit.
Yeah.
Really, really in network far away stranger. You don't need to be worried about every lacrosse team member who comes from comes to visit, but that would be a person that you could say to your kids, like, that is somebody to just be aware of. That person is really not part of the community. You know?
Someone's asking here, what are some of the red flags teenagers and young adults should look out for in a perpetrator?
Well, I think that's one of them, but
I
what do
could
you
speak
think?
a little.
Yeah.
It's very hard to say. You can't look at a room full of people and say, oh, that's a potential perpetrator, that's a potential perpetrator. But generally, we know that those who stick to sort of the rigid gender roles, particularly around what we use the phrase of toxic masculinity, which doesn't mean that men are bad. I want to be really clear about that. But that hyper masculinity of boys who have been socialized to be aggressive, to be dominant, to sort of exert their power and authority over others. And as was mentioned before, any kind of implication that somebody holds a misogynistic view or a sense of entitlement to not have to ask permission to take what's theirs. But I think, just going back to this idea around consent, again, and I understand the fact pattern and what happens on a college campus, but what we see very often is that sexual assaults take place within a relationship, maybe within a dating relationship. And so it's not always the stranger, even if it's somebody that, the in-network stranger. It could be somebody that you've had many totally okay interactions with before. And so that's really important, again, going back to teaching everyone, not just girls, but boys too, to be able to speak up and say, no, I'm not okay with this, and to respect that.
And I think that is a big culture transition and a great point between high school and college and the scene.
I've got two questions here that are kind of the same thing. It says, even today I hear teenage women, high school age, say, I just want to make everyone happy. In a group, family, etc., that classic old-fashioned line, need to please, is alive and well. What words could work to teach daughters, no, your goal is not to please others? And someone also asked this question, like the Say No to Drugs movement in the 80s. What are some non-awkward ways to back up or end sexual encounter? Girls say they feel too guilty to say no. How can they just do it?
Let's go ahead.
No, well, this is one of the reasons I talked about dairy bar. I know I talked about the cows, but one of the things we do in that exercise is role play saying no to the president of the club to go out for ice cream. So if somebody gets a card that says no matter what, you cannot say yes. And it's awkward, but we watch the student really struggle. Well, I'm lactose intolerant. And they say, oh, don't worry, they have, non-lactose. Or I have lactate in my bag. Well, I'm vegan. Oh, they have sorbet. So they really work on saying it and talking about how do we be direct about, this is not something I want to do. And I think that is where the sort of, it starts so early in respect, in fundamental respect for yourself, but also your partner, so that you're not placing your partner in a position where they're having to say no, no, no. And hopefully we're not getting to the point where we're in an exchange that's going down that road.
That's kind of what the consent idea is, right? It's like just trying to wrap your mind around like, okay, let's not try to get into a situation where I have to try to aggress and even if she's not using the word no, I can tell she's not that into it. I mean, I want to read just one quote from a student who I interviewed in my book from Syracuse. And she said, I asked her if she felt she had ever been sexually assaulted. And she said, I definitely felt pressured. My problem has always been that I didn't know how to say no. I didn't know when I wanted to say no, and I didn't know how to. And I felt bad saying no, which is so stupid. I guess I should say that it's not even that I wanted to say no. It's just that I didn't want to say yes. It's not like I was totally opposed. I was thinking, I don't want him to think I'm not interested at all, but I'm not in the mood and I'm kind of drunk. So let's just get this over with because I'd rather be watching TV. So that is like maybe something some of us old married people in the room are aware of the feeling of that. But like, we don't want the kids to feel this way. Come on, So, I mean, one idea, there's this woman in Canada who's doing this interesting research with girls. And so one of her exercises that she has is something called like, with whom would you do it? And she takes like a piece of paper and puts down different sexual acts that I do not need to enumerate for you right now, and makes them write down, with whom would I do this sexual act? Would I do this with a hookup? Would I do this with a boyfriend or girlfriend? Would I do this with only somebody who I'm committed with, not committed with, in a, marriage with, whatever, and gets them to write it all down. And I mean, she's claiming some pretty good results from things like that in terms of like, women never think in the abstract, what would I actually want to do? So that in the moment, then they're like, okay, well, he wants to do it, and I guess other people do this, and other women do it, and like, I don't want to be the one who doesn't do it and not be cool, but to try to have that kind of clear in your mind before going out at night, I mean, every little bit helps. I mean, that's basically what we're talking about. There's no like magic bullet. So,
I think the idea of practicing these skills before the moment. So I love that muscle memory, that verbal memory of even saying the word no, stop, I'm not into this. I love the idea of coming up with a practical toolkit. One of my colleagues tells a story when her son was going to parties in high school and really didn't feel like drinking. She would say, just carry the red Solo cup. You could put water in it, but if you're not ready to kind of take that stand to your peers that you don't also want to participate, find some kind of practical tip or trick. And something that hasn't come up yet that I do want to talk about a little bit is what we call bystander intervention. There's a link in the handout there to a video that was done by some students at American University about a very specific model, the 3 Ds, which I hope I can remember right now, distract, delegate, and direct. Thank you for my teammates in the room. So the idea is, and I really like this framework and the idea of bystander intervention generally because it really reframes this issue of sexual violence or domestic violence and harassment is not just between the target and the perpetrator. This is something that everyone can play a role in. And so part of the work, as I mentioned before, that we're doing with athletes is empowering them and giving them tips and tricks and tools. If they see that something might go down that doesn't feel quite right, to be able to have a script or a strategy, the distract I love, which is to go up to the perpetrator and be like, oh, hey, there's something's going on outside, come with me. Encouraging young people, if they see somebody who could potentially be a victim, maybe they've had too much to drink, maybe they've lost their friends, or they're kind of looking out of it, to just make sure that person is safe. not to turn a blind eye. And again, not just because they're afraid to get caught or something bad will happen, but because it's the right thing to do. And we find this really effective. If this could be adopted by self-identified groups like teams, if it just becomes a code, or a fraternity, or groups that are sort of self-identified and homogenous, if this becomes the norm, that it will have a ripple effect.
Meredith, I want to ask you one final question for the night before we wrap it up. What do you think really works that helps victims really heal?
That's a great question and a very personal one that I'm not sure I feel comfortable answering on behalf of victims. I think time, again, for some, sharing their stories, being validated, being believed, being heard. For some, it translates into becoming an advocate themselves. I think just feeling supported and believed by those around them who they choose to share their story is incredibly important. But it's different for everyone. And so I would encourage any of you, if you know someone who has dealt with this issue or you yourself has, to get some support. As was alluded to before when we were hearing about the story about the young woman who carried her mattress, these kinds of things take place in silence. They take place in the shadows. And part of the power is bringing it to light. Yeah, I thought that was a powerful way how you opened and closed your book with that. It was really, really remarkable. I want to thank all of you, Vanessa, Elizabeth, Meredith, for joining us. And I want to remind everyone that as the wife of an author, how important it is to purchase the books. I will give you that plug, and she'll be available to sign as well. So thank you all. Thank you all very much. Yeah.